The British Empire once grew a wall across India, not of stone, of thorns, over 1,000 miles of it, guarded by 12,000 men, and it existed to protect one thing: salt. Somewhere in central India, if you know where to look, you can still find the ghost of that wall. A hedge, grown on purpose, kept alive for decades, in places tall enough and thick enough that a man could not push through. And the whole point of it was a tax on salt, the one thing a body cannot live without. Two things to hold on to as we go. The man who policed this wall would later help start the movement that ended the empire, and 50 years on, one man walking to the sea for a handful of salt would show the world what that tax really was. This is the story of the wall an empire grew to tax being alive, and how that tax outlived the wall and helped bring the empire down. History, audited. The whole story turns on salt, so we start there. In a hot country doing hard labor, a human body needs salt to survive. You cannot choose to stop buying it, and that is exactly what makes it perfect to tax. A tax on salt is not a tax on luxury. It is a tax on being alive, paid by everyone, rich and poor, at the same flat rate. The British did not invent this idea. Indian rulers had taxed salt for centuries, and it is only fair to say so. But the British turned it into a monopoly and pushed the rate so high that for a poor family, salt could swallow a week of wages. The tax fell hardest on the people with the least, and it raised a fortune, which created a problem. If taxed salt was dear on this side of a line and cheap salt sat just across it, sooner or later someone was going to move it, and that someone was smugglers, thousands of them. Cheap, untaxed salt from the princely states kept leaking into British territory, and every grain that slipped through was revenue lost. So the empire drew a line, a customs line, running about 2,500 miles, from the northwest of India all the way down toward the Bay of Bengal. And to make that line real, to make it something a smuggler could not simply step across, they grew it. Wherever it would take root, the customs line became a living hedge, a dense wall of thorn, plum, and acacia and prickly pear, in places 12 feet high and nearly as thick. Where the hedge would not grow, they piled dead thorn in its place, mile after mile of it. 12,000 men patrolled the line. Officers manned gates along its length, stopping carts and searching them for hidden salt. An empire had grown a wall of thorns across the subcontinent, and it had done it for one reason: to guard the price of salt. The whole thing sounds insane when you say it out loud. A giant hedge, endlessly replanted, rotting and regrowing, swallowing money and men, all to protect a tax on a mineral you can scoop off the ground beside the sea. But inside the empire's ledgers, it was not insane at all. It was just accounting. The salt line paid for itself, so the salt line stood. And here's the twist that history almost lost. One of the men who ran that customs line, who built the hedge up into a real barrier, was named Allen Octavian Hume. Years later, that same Hume would help found the Indian National Congress, the party that would one day end British rule. The man who had policed the empire's salt helped build the movement that took the empire apart. By 1879, the line was given up, the tax now collected at the salt works themselves. The hedge was left to die, and it died so completely that 100 years later, people refused to believe it had ever stood. But the tax did not die with it. The tax stayed. And the tax is where the story turns for the last time. 50 years after the hedge was abandoned, a lawyer named Gandhi looked at that salt tax and saw what the empire had missed. He saw that a tax on salt was the perfect target because it was the perfect injustice. It touched everyone. It hurt the poorest most. And it taxed a thing you could simply walk to the ocean and make for yourself. So in 1930, he did. He walked 240 miles to the sea, reached down, and lifted a lump of natural salt, breaking the law in the simplest way a person could. Millions followed him. The Salt March did not win independence on its own, but it did something the empire could not survive. It showed the whole world that British rule in India had come down to stopping people from making salt, and the moral authority never fully recovered. The honest part is this: the salt tax was a rational way to raise money, and the British were not the first to reach for it. But rational is not the same as legitimate. When your revenue depends on taxing the one thing the poorest cannot live without, you have written the argument against yourself, and sooner or later, someone will read it back to you. The hedge is gone now, grown over and forgotten, a wall of thorns that once cut a subcontinent in two. But it is worth remembering, because it is what a tax looks like when you follow it all the way down. Not a number in a ledger, a living wall, 12,000 guards, and in the end, one man walking to the sea. That is the true cost of taxing salt. This has been Tariq ka Hisaab, history audited. If this is the kind of thing your textbook skipped, subscribe, and we will keep reading the receipts.